Can I welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Transport Committee of the 2020-21 year. In accordance with government regulations, we are holding this meeting on a virtual basis with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session. I will also introduce each guest as they join us. Our main discussion today will be on COVID-19 and London's transport network. Everyone is encouraged to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag Assembly Transport. Before we start, I would just like to remind all members that this is a key issue for Londoners. We have the Deputy Mayor and key senior officials from TfL with us. This is a key opportunity for us to question them about the impact of COVID-19 on London's transport system. We have a full agenda, and I do intend to keep to time to use our guests' time and our own as effectively as possible. And therefore, I will move the meeting on if needs be during the process. But other than that, I would like to start the meeting and ask the clerk, Laura Pelling, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence.
Chair, there are no apologies for absence. To confirm, we have the following members attending today's meeting. We have yourself, Chair, Assembly Member Moore, Deputy Chair, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Bailey, Assembly Member Devonish, Assembly Member Eshlomi, Assembly Member Curtin, Assembly Member McCartney, Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member Russell and Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you very much. Could I ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent to avoid any interruptions, and that during the Q&A session, microphones are set to mute until you are called to speak. And as discussed in the pre-meeting, guests can alert me that they want to speak either by raising their hand or by unmuting and speaking. Are there any other declarations? Can we note the list of declarations in the report before us?
Noted. No.
Can we note the membership and chairing arrangements for this committee, please?
Noted. No.
Can we further note the terms of reference of the committee?
Agreed. Noted.
Thank you. Can we note the standing delegations of authority to the chair of the committee?
Noted. Noted.
Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Transport Committee held on the 12th of March 2020 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. And my thanks go to Carolyn Pigeon, the Deputy Chair, for chairing and signing off those minutes informally. Can we note the summary list of actions and additional correspondence that has been received?
Agreed.
Noted.
Can we note the action taken under delegated authority by me as Chair as set out in the report?
Noted.
Thank you. And can we also note the accessible and inclusive transport report, the letter to the Secretary of State and our consultation submissions?
Noted, Chair.
Noted.
There are two issues that will be picked up in the July meeting, but I'm verbally reporting that we have in agreement written a letter of welcome to the new Chief Commissioner, and we will also be taking we'll be reporting back on the bus and tram report at the July meeting. That's everything there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much, members. So I would like to welcome the Deputy Mayor Heidi Alexander, Simon Killenback, Chief Finance Officer for TfL, Andy Lord, the Managing Director of the London Underground, Gareth Powell, Managing Director, Surface Transport TfL, Vernon Everett, Managing Director, Customers Communication and Technology for TfL, and Stuart Harvey, Director of Major Projects for TfL. May I first invite the Deputy Mayor to make an opening statement prior to us moving into our question and answer session. Ms. Alexander.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. If I may, I'd like to start by thanking colleagues at TfL and City Hall for the Herculean efforts that they have made over the last 3 months to help London respond to this crisis. Whilst it does feel like a lifetime away now, there were days in March when I must admit I was wondering whether the tubes would still be running. And there were days in April when I was unsure whether we could continue to operate a bus network. And there were days in May, in the heat of the funding negotiations with government, when I wondered whether TfL would still exist in a few months' time. These statements may sound melodramatic, but they are all true. We are collectively living through one of the most astonishing periods of this city's history. The fact that we have kept the tubes and buses running is testament to the 60,000 incredible men and women who work on the front line of our transport network, the train drivers, bus workers, cleaners and maintenance staff. I would like to thank each and every one of them. In the face of widespread staff illness and absence, income streams collapsing and unnecessarily difficult funding discussions with government, the senior team at TfL have shown great resilience, compassion and determination too. We wouldn't have got through this without you. Back in March, we turned an oil tanker around in a matter of hours. We went from being an organisation whose primary purpose was to promote the use of public transport to one which told people to get off it. We took hundreds of difficult operational decisions, hour by hour, day by day. New cleaning regimes, timetable changes, station closures, turning off the congestion charge, granting rent relief to small businesses, closing down our construction sites. The list is quite simply endless. We used announcements about the public transport network to drive behaviour change across a city of 9 million people. Stay home, don't travel. We acted ahead of government at a time when every day mattered. Since then, we have lost colleagues, men, and they are all men, who came to work during the peak of the pandemic to help others get to theirs. The deaths of 44 transport workers, including 29 bus drivers, weighs heavily upon me, and I ask myself constantly whether there was anything more we could have done to prevent their suffering and the pain their families are now experiencing. We will probably never know where those 44 men caught the virus, but I do know that we will leave no stone unturned in asking ourselves the difficult questions and taking every action available to us to keep our services as safe as possible. I also know that just as London's transport network was at the heart of our efforts to curb the spread of COVID, it will be at the heart of our recovery. I'm pleased that we were able to secure a funding deal with government to enable TfL to operate services for the next 4 months. But I was angry and disappointed by the political conditions that were crowbarred into the agreement at the last minute. Londoners had done the right thing and stayed at home. As a consequence, fare income dropped by 90%. You don't have to be a trained accountant to work out that if fares and other commercial activity make up 80% of your day-to-day running budget, you've got a problem when you only have 10% of that coming in. Government, though, are insisting on higher fares next year and the removal of free travel for children and young people, settling old political scores in the middle of a global pandemic. I really hope that the next phase of negotiations with government can be done in a more constructive manner. We cannot get to a situation again where we are minutes away from needing to make decisions that would be incredibly harmful to the city just because government haven't properly engaged or because they can't resist political game playing in advance of next year's London elections. As the Mayor has said, the deal we did in May is nothing more than a sticking plaster, and there is an urgent need to agree a long-term, sustainable funding arrangement to enable the delivery of essential transport services in the capital. The way in which people travel around our city will change as a result of this crisis. People's lives have changed, their expectations have changed too, and we are not out of the woods yet. We don't know the extent to which people will return to our tubes and buses or how quickly, but we do know that we can't have a car-based recovery, rising levels of air pollution, replacing one public health crisis with another. A safe, reliable and affordable public transport network remains critical to the success of this city. Our ability to get more people walking and cycling is also more important than ever. I look forward to working with Assembly members to make this happen over the year ahead, And I'm very happy to answer your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those opening remarks and for setting the context of the discussion today. And if I may, I will open the questioning today. To yourself, Deputy Mayor, and to Vernon Everett, how prepared is TfL to maintain increased service provision in response to the projected demand associated with easing of lockdown, considering staffing pressures and restricted financial resources?
Okay, perhaps if I start with that one, Chair, and then I may ask Vernon to come in if I miss anything. I do think we're well prepared. I think it might be helpful if I set out what we're seeing at the moment in terms of service provision and passenger numbers. So on the tube, we're running over 90% of normal services. And in the peak on some lines, such as the Victoria line this morning, we're running 100% of normal services. So we've moved back to running our pre-COVID timetable, but we do have some planned cancellations within that. And at the moment, we've got about 8% of frontline underground staff who are still shielding and are therefore off work, and that's quite a significant number. So last week on the tube, travel was at about 10 to 12% of normal levels. Now that's clearly up on the 5% that it was running at during the height of the pandemic. But what we have seen is more of a sort of trickle back to the tube network than a surge, and I think that has been replicated again this morning. On the buses, we're running nearly 90% of normal services, despite having quite a number of bus drivers who are still furloughed. And whilst we don't have completely comprehensive ridership data, because we are still waiting to return some buses to front door loading, we think that probably travel has been at around 25% of normal levels last week, perhaps up to 30% this morning. So this is quite consistent with the pattern that we saw during the lockdown, where the numbers of people as a percentage using our buses was actually higher than what was happening on the tube. So we've got a really comprehensive plan going forward. We've done a huge communications campaign saying to people, you have to continue to work at home if you can do so. I can't really overstate that enough. You know, the fact that people like us are doing this hearing virtually and staying away from the public transport network means that we are in effect giving space to people who need to be physically present to do their jobs. We've said to people, you know, please shop locally, don't make unnecessary journeys on the public transport network, especially at peak times in the early hours of the morning. We do need people to still exercise some restraint, to be honest. People are going to have to wear a face mask if they're making journeys on public transport. If people are getting on a train into a central London station, we'd need people to be walking instead of jumping on the tube or a bus to get to their final destination. We do also need people to be thinking about whether they might be able to get off the tube a couple of stops early in order to relieve that overall pressure on the network. We've put in a cap on the number of passengers that can get onto our buses, and so the driver has discretion to not stop at a stop if the bus is already full. Obviously it would need to stop if people need to get off. And we've got a lot of plans in place, which Andy may wish to talk about how we might activate queuing systems at our busier stations if the need arises. We've brought in stewarding resources, to be placed around those hotspots on the London Underground network. We're working with the British Transport Police. So I do think we're well prepared.
Thank you very much for that. If I might, you were going to ask Vernon Everett to pick up, but before you do, can I just ask what sort of progress you've made in terms of using journey planners and social media alerts to help passengers avoid those hotspot stations?
Yeah, so I might ask Vernon to speak on the detail actually of the changes that we've made to Journey Planner, because we have done a number of things to change the information that's available on those pages, also the sort of station update pages on our website, We've had, I think it's 60 million emails that have gone out to customers since the beginning of this crisis, with about a 42% open rate to advise people about how they should be changing their journey patterns throughout this period. And so, Vernon, I don't know whether you want to speak specifically about some of those changes that we've made.
Yes, thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Chair. Just to build on that, and specifically your question about the journey plan. We've always been a great promoter of free open data at TfL, so that we can enable, through a unified application program interface, other third parties to plug in to our information like Citymapper, Google Maps, and so on, to actually draw from it. But what we've specifically been doing with the Journey Planner is to really promote walking and cycling options as a way of mitigating the capacity constraint that we have on public transport at the moment. So we've started with journeys where walking and cycling options are under 40 minutes, so that when you interrogate Journey Planner to plan a journey, you will get a walking and cycling option first. And that's quite a fundamental sort of re-engineering of the Journey Planner system. I think just to build on what Heidi was saying about public transport capacity, we are, of course, promoting very heavily walking and cycling more generally. And if you, again, look at our website, we are promoting the tube walking map, cycle parking, cycling maps that demonstrate to people the network of cycling facilities that are available. And we're working very hard to update all of that material almost in real time as the street space programme, being led by Gareth and Will Norman, rolls out, so that people are aware of the new facilities that are being made available for walking and cycling. And we're also working very carefully or very closely with boroughs, because there's an enormous amount of happening across boroughs, which I'm sure Gareth will describe a bit later on, which we're also plugging in to the Journey Planner. And all of that goes on top of our Twitter feeds, our social media feeds, and the sort of information that we provide in real time at stations and on vehicles. So there's a huge communications effort. I can go into more detail in questions, but that's the overview.
Thank you very much. Now, Assembly Member Prince, I believe you wanted to come in and ask a question on this section.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Lovely, thank you. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Could I ask you, first of all, I understand that as part of the bailout agreement, you undertook to get back to 100% services within 4 weeks. I believe that 4 weeks was up on June the 11th. You've indicated that a couple of services are not quite yet 100%. I'd also wondered if all the underground stations are open now.
So, I mean, the short answer to that, and perhaps Andy Lord would like to comment on it, is that a number of the lines have been operating in the early morning peak at 100%. We've, broadly speaking, every line is sort of up around at least 90% in that early morning peak. We do have still significant numbers of people who are particularly in that shielded category, as I said in my introductory remarks. So whilst we're not quite there yet with the return to normal service levels, of course, normally you probably run 98% or so of services. You're not always at 100%. And so there's been huge progress made. Andy may want to say more about the detail of that.
Thanks, Heidi, and thank you for the question. And thank you, Chair. It's my first appearance at the Transport Committee since I joined, so thank you. Sorry, I've not had a chance to meet you all yet. As part of the funding agreement, the requirement is to get back to normal service levels, and as Heidi's alluded to, we don't always operate at 100% of service in normal times because there's a variety of operational issues, so we're typically around 95 to 98% of full schedule. And we were very clear and agreed with the Department for Transport that our primary focus was around achieving normal service levels during the morning and evening peaks, Monday to Friday, and we're at those levels now. In fact, we're exceeding them on some of the lines, as Heidi's alluded to. So, for example, on the Victoria line, we're delivering 36 trains an hour in the peak, which is one train every 80 seconds. And we're actually delivering a higher rate of service than most of the national rail industry across the country. So we're very close to that, and we've done it in line with the government's easing of lockdown restrictions, so focusing on the areas where either ridership is likely to increase through schools, and obviously today was a critical day with non-essential retail, so working very closely through Vernon's team with the key business communities and retail sectors to make sure that we manage the travel demand accordingly. Our focus now is to get our weekend services up to normal levels. They're slightly below at the moment. Again, there's been no need and no demand to get those services up to near normal levels. We're not far off, and that's the focus going forward. It's worth highlighting as well, we obviously have suspended night tube on a Friday and Saturday evening. That still means we're running tubes until about 1 in the morning and restarting services at about 5:15, 5:30 in the morning on Saturdays and Sundays as well. That again, there's no economic need for night tube at the moment. We'll keep that under review. And in terms of stations, we opened some more stations today. We have 25 closed in total. That's a strategic decision based on our absence levels and to make sure that we maintain a sustained level of service for our customers. And one of those stations closed obviously is Heathrow Terminal 4, which has been closed at the airport's request because the terminal's currently shut. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just come back and thank you for that. As you haven't, I mean, you've pretty much met most of the government's requirements, which is excellent, and congratulate you on that. Just two questions out of that. One, as you haven't fully met those conditions, do you think there will be any comeback from the government to question you on why you haven't quite achieved that? And secondly, whilst I understand that most of this is because you have too few staff, what efforts have you made to maybe, like the police, like the NHS, to recruit recently retired people to bring that number up so that you can deliver a full service?
So very happy to respond on those. So on the first question, we're in very regular dialogue with Department for Transport. I attend a weekly, it was daily for a period of time, it's now a weekly call along with Gareth to talk about wider DFT and TfL issues. And equally this morning, tomorrow and Wednesday, I'm on a daily call with the Secretary of State along with Network Rail and National Rail RDG members. And I think it's fair to say that the DFT are very satisfied with the level of service that we've delivered, the openness that we've demonstrated to them. We've shared all our data, all our information, and I would say actually we've taken a lead for the rail industry as a whole in a number of areas, and which Network Rail and National Rail have been taking as a result. In terms of few staff absence, we have absolutely looked at getting recently retired colleagues, ex-colleagues back. The most critical area for us was around our service control centres. Each line has its own service control centre. Some of those control centres only have 30 people in total. So when you're running at 25-30% of absence, which we were in the peak, and if you lose an entire shift of staff, which may only be 3 or 5 people, you would actually run the risk of losing the entire line. So we did bring back some recently retired members of staff, which helped bolster our service levels and our contingency. We did look at the feasibility of bringing back train operators, but the biggest challenge we have, along with the whole national rail sector, is that to bring back anybody, you have to retrain them and at least re-certify them. And that's impossible to do at the moment under 2 metre social distancing, because that requires 2 people in a train cab or a tube cab. And currently that is suspended nationally because there's no solution at the moment for undertaking training with social distancing and a suitable mitigation. And that's a key priority for us and the rest of the rail industry to solve.
Okay, just finally, if I may, Chair, on the buses, You've got the 20-person bus rule on the double-deckers, 10 on the singles, I believe, and you've got the face mask rules. A couple of bus drivers have been in touch with me because they're not clear exactly how they're expected to enforce these rules. Could you perhaps give us an indication, Deputy Mayor or anyone else, what advice is being given to bus drivers, or what advice you're giving to bus operators on how they can enforce, and what level of discretion would the bus driver have in these situations, please?
I think the best person to answer that might be Gareth Powell, actually. Gareth?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon, Chair. And yes, Keith, on that issue, what we've been doing is we've been saying to bus drivers that the 20 and the 10 limits that you referred to, clearly they do have some discretion around that. If, for example, a family came on who obviously don't need to observe social distancing in the same way, maybe a mother with 2 young children or so on, but generally they are asked to maintain the limit at or about 20 people, say, on a double-decker bus. What that means in practice is once they feel that limit has been got to, then they won't stop at bus stops unless a passenger on the bus, of course, asks to get off, in which case they can start letting new passengers on. So they're doing that in respect of the face masks. Clearly, we've asked our bus drivers to give advice to customers and so on. It's not their role to get into a conflict situation or otherwise with customers. We're seeing very good levels actually today of compliance with customers who are really behaving very sensibly. The vast majority, maybe 80 to 90% of customers are wearing face coverings, and others maybe just weren't aware of it, or maybe had forgotten it. So that's going really, really well. Ultimately, the enforcement activity for face coverings is a matter on buses for the Metropolitan Police and our own specially trained enforcement staff. But clearly, we don't think in the vast majority of cases it will come to that, because customers are behaving exactly as we've asked them to do, and we're very encouraged by the response we've seen today.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just to finish, I just think it's a little unfortunate, Deputy Mayor, that you did bring politics into your opening speech. You know, we're working with the government. The government have given £1 billion to TfL, lent £500 million to TfL, and you know you've got to have an ongoing relationship with them. So attacking them.
Chair, we've got a question coming up later on.
Well,
Assembly
Navin, if you
Member
let me finish the questions in there. You think it's sensible to...
Assembly Member Prince, you've had quite a large bite of the cherry, and I did say I would move people on. And unless the Deputy Mayor would like to comment, I would like to move on to Assembly Member Eshalomi's question. Okay, can we... sorry to shut you down, but we do want to use this time effectively. Assembly Member Eshalomi, would you like to ask your question 2B?
Thank you, Chair. Just coming back to what we were discussing, Chair, and guests, and good morning, everybody. So you just mentioned, Gareth, in terms of people responding and adhering to the guidelines and staying at home. But obviously, one of the issues is that from today, as you know, non-essential shops have opened again. We've seen, I'm sure some of you are watching the scenes this morning of people queuing up outside the number of the stores, you know, eager to go back. And on the one hand, it's really good. We need to support the economy, but equally, we need to make sure that the people who are getting to those jobs, they have to find a way to get there. For some people, it's not practical to walk or cycle. They have to use public transport. How are you going to be monitoring the transport services to make sure that they are being used for essential services?
So I don't know whether Vernon might want to come in on this one. I mean, we have done a huge amount of work with the business community, with retailers, to actually encourage retailers to stagger their opening times, so that, you know, if you're opening at, say, 11 o'clock in the morning and not closing until 7 o'clock, you're actually then enabling your staff to travel in a point in the day when the pressure on the public transport network isn't so acute, because what we've seen over the last couple of months is that there's been quite a lot of pressure in the very early hours of the morning, and the evening peak has also come forward. And so we've had some success in our communications with retailers about that. We've been talking to people like Westfield, the new West End company. Now, you know, clearly as more people return to work, there are going to be increasing numbers of people on the public transport network. That's why we are making sure that in addition to all of this work that we're doing with businesses, we've also got a very clear communications campaign, which is saying to people, if you are able to work from home, you must continue to do so, because we're not going to be able to manage this period going forward unless we do keep the numbers of people overall on the public transport network down. We have, very, very detailed data that we can, almost access in real time about different loadings on the tube network. Once we get back to, being able to obtain all the data on the bus network as well, we can actually look at which bus routes are seeing, higher than normal passenger numbers. And so we constantly monitor that, and then we sort of look to see whether there is a way in which we can, adjust the service that we're providing to ensure that we've got the right services in the right place at the right time. And we've done that, to be fair, throughout the period of the pandemic.
Heidi and Chair, may I just build on what Heidi was saying on the work that we've done with businesses? So sort of taking some of the learnings from the Olympic Games, although this is completely different order, but taking some of the learnings from that, we have engaged with well over 1,000 London businesses over the last couple of weeks, primarily to spread the shoulders of that peak that Heidi was talking about. So in the mornings, the busiest times are between 05:45 and 08:15. And in the evening, it's 1600 to 1730. Now, one of the things that we've tried to do, keeping the messages really simple, is working with those businesses, some of whom are retailers, some of whom are other types of businesses who employ many people in London, to spread that peak. And actually, when you look at the way in which people are starting just to very slowly ebb back onto the transport system, a lot of the higher rates of growth are actually in the off-peak times. So many of the retailers, for example, agreed that their opening hours should be late morning, and that their closing hours should run beyond the evening peak, 6, 7 o'clock in the evening. So we've worked very, very closely with businesses of all shapes and sizes and their representative groups, and also with schools. We've done an immense amount of engagement with schools, because if we think back to previous days when some of the restrictions of lockdown have been eased, that has entailed some school children going back, and there's a huge programme, particularly when you look out to September and beyond, of work to do there to ensure that that school children can get to and from their place of education safely as well. So an enormous amount of activity, and we published where the hotspot locations are, what the times and places of the hotspot stations are, and we'll keep that engagement rolling. And we're extremely grateful for all of the help that we've had from the business community.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Shalimi, would you want to follow that up?
That's it for me, Chair. Just mindful of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, if nobody else has anything to, I will move on to Assemblymember Pigeon and question 2C, please.
Lovely, thank you very much. And can I just put on record my thanks to the officers at TfL and the Deputy Mayor for keeping us so well briefed throughout this very difficult period and listening to feedback from us when we've had suggestions. I think it's been really appreciated by us as members, and the job they've had to do. I've got a couple of questions. We've already started touching on this issue of flexing the services, how you can shift services to meet demand. I can see that's very possible with buses, and you can easily increase buses potentially or shift the services around, possibly wondering what you've been doing in buses, but also things like the DLR and tram, whether you've been able to look to flex the services there to meet the demand and also your projected demand, as we're starting to see. I think Heidi used the phrase people trickling back over the coming weeks and months. I wonder whether, maybe, not sure if Heidi wants to answer, or Gareth, perhaps.
Shall I start, Gareth, and then you might be able to add some detail? I mean, as you quite rightly say, Caroline, there are ways in which you can flex the bus network, and you may recall from the conversations that we've had over the last couple of months that when we moved to a Sunday timetable for the buses, what we chose to do was to make sure that we kept the services that were running early in the mornings across the week at a much higher level of frequency, because that's when we saw that the demand was there. And so we essentially modified the Sunday timetable to ensure that we still had enough buses running at the times when most people were wanting to travel. We actually have done sort of similar things on the tube, even though you're also right to say it is a bit more complicated. And so at the point at which we stopped running the night tube, we looked at what services we needed to provide in the very early hours of the morning on a Saturday and Sunday, which might have previously been caught up within that night tube timetable. And one of the reasons behind stopping the Waterloo and City line was so that we were able to use the driver resource to bolster the central line. And we also tweaked services throughout the day. So, in effect, we took some of the driver resource that may have been on later in the afternoon and put it into those early hours on the central line in the morning, where we could see that there were more challenges at certain stations. And so we have been doing that. And the other thing that we were doing is, because we've got this very, very granular data on where trains are most loaded and at what times, you could take decisions if you knew that there was a sort of problem that was emerging at, say, Canning Town, for example. You might choose to non-stop some DLR services so as not to add more people into the mix in that station. I think on the DLR and the trams, Gareth could pick this up, but we're pretty much up to normal levels of service now on both of those modes, aren't we, Gareth? Or did you want to pick up on that?
Thank you, Heidi. No, just to add that we are on the trams operating 100% of our previous timetable, and that's the maximum level of service that we can obviously operate. On the DLR, one thing we have done is that we have lengthened each of the trains to be 3 cars. So some people might recall some trains are at 2 cars, some are at 3 cars, so they're now all at 3 cars, which allows the maximum amount of space for people to socially distance within there. And then on the London Overground, just to complete the picture, we have been running additional shuttles where we see very precise levels of peak loading, just as Heidi described on the tube. We put in the odd extra train service just to help move the peak of the peak where we've seen it away. So we're doing what we can within the constraints of those systems, and obviously driver resources and so on.
Might you consider some express buses, for example, if you can see peaks and sort of loadings, and then maybe some stopping ones on routes to try to help as more and more people return to work?
Thank you. That's a good suggestion. We're obviously looking at some opportunities for that. I think that it's very challenging to produce express buses because, of course, if you have a stopping and a express, the express has got to go round the stopping bus in order to be able to maintain. So that can be really challenging, and it can be quite confusing for customers to make sure they're on the right vehicle, obviously. So, but we are looking for opportunities where we can vary the service in the way that you described, because if it looks like it's going to be useful, where we can see patterns of demand going from one place to another, and we think we can serve that better, then that's exactly what we'll try and do with our operators.
Lovely, thank you. And if I move on then to my next area of questions, which really are to Stuart Harvey and Simon Killenbach, is looking at how is TfL's capital delivery programme being reprioritised in the wake of COVID-19? You had your business plan set out bold vision and plans for London. We're obviously in a very different place now. So maybe Stuart or Simon, could you talk me through that, please?
It's Simon Killenbach, Caroline. I'll talk you through this, and then Stuart can come in terms of the details. So clearly, given where we are, our entire capital programme prioritisation will be subject to the further funding agreement with government, which will need to take place over the summer. And we are working currently on a fully revised budget that we'll be taking to the TfL board at the end of July. And in that process, we'll make very transparent and clear the prioritisation methodology and what it is we are suggesting that we believe government should fund. But to get into the detail of it, given what happened with the coronavirus, we internally have slightly reframed our core purpose to being keeping London moving and working safely and sustainably, rather than focusing on growth, given where we are. And the impact of COVID means that we are unlikely to return to our previous business plan without significant external funding support and a change in our funding model, which I'll also come to. You'll remember that last year, when we talked to you at the Budget and Performance Committee, we had identified the baseline costs for continuing to provide existing service levels and maintaining and renewing our core transport assets was about 1.4 billion per annum. And this is the cost before any enhancements or improvements to elements of our network. These are the safety critical and asset condition investments that we must make in order to deliver a safe and reliable service, and they will always be the very first thing that we prioritise. In terms of the emergency budget, when we had to act very quickly to, having been told by government on the 12th of April, we mitigate our costs ourselves before we got a funding package, we therefore put in some conditions for the immediate capital programme, which was to substantially complete anything that was already near completion or was fully contractually committed and would have cost us more money to stop than to continue. Ensuring that we completed projects on site where they had been subject to safe stop. So we put, as you will know, safe stop in for our construction activities. And again, in terms of remobilising them, which we have been doing over the last few weeks, we are remobilising them where it makes sense to do so and where our contractual obligations outweigh any benefits of further pausing. As I mentioned, we are obviously prioritising our safety and operationally critical renewals, which includes a majority of surface asset renewals, which have been, as you know, on a 2-year pause and remain on pause through the summer. There are also some projects that will help with revenue generation or operating cost savings. So continuing to work on the expansion of ULEZ clearly makes sense because that's something that can be done safely and rather than working remotely. And then some of the new areas that we've had to really focus on are the projects that support social distancing. And our Healthy Street funding has been refocused on measures that support social distancing through this period. Going forward, clearly it's difficult to think about what life in London will be like post the crisis and will it return to normal. So our city planning team have put together some long-term strategic scenarios which look at different ways from returning to normal to very different ways in which London may be lived in, worked and used by people following this public health crisis. Those 4 or 5 long-term scenarios we are using to help with longer-term thoughts about what we should prioritise for our capital programme. It seems to make sense now that we should intensify and accelerate our active travel work, our social distancing measures, including intensifying our existing public transport services so we can carry the people at a safe distance and promoting public health, accelerating our decarbonisation, carbon reduction agenda, and seeking to prevent a car-based recovery. Because we've promoted some of those things, some of the things that we are less certain on the need for in the near term are big additions to public transport capacity, and as yet we don't know what the demand will be for new homes and the transport services to connect to those. So, as I said, the work is ongoing. The emergency budget was an interim measure to allow us to achieve short-term funding, but we will be going to the TfL board at the end of July with a suggested second half of the year, and then we'll be following our normal business planning process over the autumn and engaging with government about those longer-term priorities.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And if you are able to share some of that work around the methodology ahead of that meeting, in July, and also these scenarios. I think it sounds very interesting. Maybe I think certainly I'm sure other members would be interested in getting an understanding from you on how you're trying to plan in this sort of unknown world. But perhaps I might get Stuart in. So I want to specifically ask about some major projects. I'm not touching on the cycling and walking, other colleagues are doing that, but I really want to understand, have you looked at a revised sort of completion date for some of your big capital projects, whether it's Crossrail, whether it's Bank Station, whether it's Northern Line extension, the 4-line modernisation, you know, that was due in 2023. Have you already started looking at revised completion dates for those projects, Stuart?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Chair. So we are right in the midst of understanding the impact of our safe stop. So we're working very closely with our suppliers, collaboratively to understand what progress they could make during the safe stop on construction sites. They have continued to make progress. We're looking as we go back onto site, which we're doing in a staggered, very safe manner, putting safety of our workers at the core of what we're doing. We're looking at the sort of productivity that's being made. But right this moment, it's too early to say exactly what impact there's going to be, but we are going through it very carefully, and we'll be reporting on that going forward, obviously at the TfL board and other sessions.
Great, thank you for that. And in terms of your work with your supply chain, obviously looking at the year 1920, I think TfL spent £6 billion with the wider supply chain. How are you engaging with the rail supply chain at the moment? I've heard from the industry they feel they really need clarity at the moment, and they want TfL to actively engage them, understanding what is going forward. And clearly, some suppliers, their future is in doubt unless they know what work is coming. And also, I know Network Rail and High Speed 2 Limited have made a solid commitment for prompt payments to their supply chain. Will TfL make a similar commitment? Perhaps you could outline what you're doing in that area.
So I'll let Simon come in on the payment, but we have engaged the best we could with the supply chain. So very early on, we got the supply chain all together, capital supply chain, to tell them what was going on, explain the reasons behind the safe stop. And I must say there was real support for that. People understood the need for that. We've recently got the supply chain back together. There was a bit of a gap in between while Simon and I and others, particularly Simon, had to work with government to get the funding. It's very unclear on what basis we can move forward. So it's been very difficult to communicate with the supply chain, but we have got back with them last week. They'll welcome that. And again, they're working really closely with us to understand how we move forward, to make sure that we both, supplier and client, come to the other end of this in a meaningful way that means our projects continue to deliver in an efficient manner. But Simon, do you want to touch on the payment point?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And I think also on the funding point, because obviously that was very key. Assembly Member Pigeon, we made the case right from the beginning of the crisis in March that we believed TfL should be treated in the same way as Network Rail and Highways England, in that if we were fully funded through the crisis, we would be better able to support the supply chain and commit to the public, the Cabinet Office public procurement notice to support our suppliers. Unfortunately, we spent a period of time negotiating the funding, and at the end of that, we were not fully funded in the same way, and therefore this has had an impact on what we can continue to do and what we can't. We would want in the second half to try again to make the case that using TfL and recognising us as a public transport infrastructure entity that can fully support its supply chain if adequately funded to do so, we would very much advocate that that is in the best interests of the supply chain in the UK and indeed throughout the country and throughout the world. We do commit to prompt payment, and we always do commit to prompt payment. So we pay all our SMEs within 10 days, and we pay all of our suppliers within 30 days from the date of invoice. So the date of receipt of invoice. So we very much comply with that. But it's the other measures around the support for the supply chain which we haven't been able to fully deliver as we would have wished because of the way our funding settlement was concluded.
Lovely, thank you. And then finally, just on step-free access, obviously you had a programme of another 12 stations that were due to be step-free by March. That had slipped before COVID. The Elizabeth line by 2021, all the Elizabeth line stations are supposed to be step-free. Do you think you'll still be able to keep that that deadline, or what are your figures looking like, and when will you be able to tell us about step-free, which is so important to so many Londoners?
As Stuart said, we're going through the process now, really, of understanding the full implication upon our programmes, and when we come back to the board in July with our revised budget, we'll be better able to set out what that means for all of the programmes, including step-free, in terms of timing and delivery and prioritisation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now, thank you very much for those very helpful answers. I have indications from a number of Assembly members who would like to follow up on this. So I have Assembly Member Bailey, Assembly Member Shah, Assembly Member Devonish and Assembly Member McCartney. So if I can take Assembly Member Bailey first, please. But can we keep our questioning tight on this?
Good afternoon to all our guests. Hello, Deputy Mayor. Firstly, can I just build on the comments made by AM Pigeon about the level of work you're doing? It's really good to see that TfL are really getting involved, and it's great to see the level of innovation you're talking about. I just want to focus on your capital projects. Over the last 4 years, there have been frequent alterations to the capital projects, with 22 being paused or cancelled, whatever. Would it be possible to give us the details of what all those projects were and when the completion date would be now, in view of the new challenges that you have? It'd be very important, I think, to give us that sort of detail through the chair, if you could write to the committee, to give us that detail so that we can look at your capital project going forward, which will obviously be significantly different. Would that be possible?
So yes, Assembly Member Bailey, as I said, as we go through this revised budget process towards the end of July, we'll be able to write to you and provide that detail.
Okay, and could you just let us know the financial impact of stopping or starting any of those projects? That would be very important, because it'll help us to look at where your next steps are and what impact they'll have for London.
Thank you, Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Can I take Assembly Member Shah next, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Like Assembly Member Pigeon, I'd also like to thank Deputy Mayor for regular weekly briefings for the Transport Committee, which were extremely helpful. And thank you and your team for putting together those. Moving on to question about Crossrail project. Can Simon or Stuart give us an update both on the current situation with financing as well as completion? Thank you.
Heidi, did you want to come in first, or are you happy?
No, I think, Simon, I'm happy for you to cover that one.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Assembly Member Shah. So clearly, the Crossrail project has also been through a safe stop of its construction activities, although they have continued to tackle the big assurance mountain that they have to climb in order to complete the project during this period. So there is a board meeting later this month where the officers of Crossrail will present to the Crossrail board the first cut of what they think that means in terms of the schedule and timings for the Crossrail project, but more realistically, by the July board, we're expecting to have some detailed analysis of what the COVID impact has been upon Crossrail. You're right to point out that the Crossrail funding needs to be resolved, and that is very much part of the negotiations we have agreed will take place with government over the summer, need to be concluded by the end of September, so that we can know by that stage not only TfL's funding, but the funding through to completion of the Crossrail project.
Chair, through you, can I also thank Tony Meggs, the chair of Crossrail, who has, during pandemic period, kept both Deputy Chair Caroline Pigeon and myself up to date with the progress. There were, I appreciate, initially severe concerns about supply chains, but I believe that is no longer an issue. And from what I hear, that certainly there's still aspiration, if not clear commitment to try and, I think what was noted here as Tony Mack's comment to meet or beat the current deadline of summer 2021. Is that kind of realistic situation to sort of put on record?
Can I just perhaps say
Yeah,
something
sure.
in answer to this question, actually? I mean, I think you're right to say, Assembly Member Shah, that is the aspiration of Crossrail. Yeah. I mean, clearly, as Simon has set out, some of the remaining construction works that are going on have had to have stopped during this period. They've restarted. They were able to do what they called niche working, where they were able to send a small number of people onto sites to, aid the assurance and safety certification process, but they have also had to pause dynamic testing. It's my understanding that has restarted now. And of course, they're in a situation where, just like none of us know what's going to happen in the autumn, whether there will be a repeat wave of infections or perhaps repeated waves, they need to actually look at the programme of works that they've got going forward and make an assessment about how they best organise those works in order to get into the trial running and trial operations period, which we know is so critical. And so I think, with a lot of construction projects, you need to look at really what the implications are. I think it's very challenging for them, to be honest, at the moment. And as Simon said, their board are going to need to look in detail at what the programme is going forward before making, any statements about their ability to meet that summer 2021, date or otherwise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, could I take Assembly Member Devenish, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Deputy Mayor. I sent to your office 2 questions in advance of this afternoon's meeting, one on Hammersmith Bridge and one on Pimlico tube noise. So on the bridge, can you please update me on your reopening plans? Do you agree that post-coronavirus, with walking, cycling and public transport even more central to London's transport needs to revive our economy, a closed bridge is a real hindrance to West London, especially to the elderly and disabled Londoners?
Well, I think what I would say in response to that is that, everyone would like to get this bridge reopened to motorised traffic. You will be aware that there is a very hefty price tag attached to that piece of work. What we have been able to do during the course of the last couple of months is progress the design work. We've completed some work to 2 of the pedestals on the bridge. We were also progressing plans, as you know, for a temporary walking and cycling bridge to give unimpeded access to the main bridge. Now, the pandemic has had a very, very big impact on TfL's finances. There's no getting away from it. One of the very last meetings that I had actually before the sort of pandemic really hit in mid-March was a discussion with Baroness Veer at the Department for Transport about what financial support that government could give to enable us to move forward with the restoration plans for the bridge. Now, those discussions have been parked whilst we've been dealing with all of these other huge issues. We need to stay in touch with Hammersmith and Fulham, who own the bridge. But at the moment, there is not an easy way in which to find £120 million in TfL's capital programme in order to do this work. And so if government will assist us in funding this, when we can make it happen. And, I saw in the media over the weekend that the government are looking for shovel-ready projects to invest in. Well, we've got the design work there now. And we could move forward with this, but it will require government support in order to get that bridge reopened.
Thank you. I think we all understand that. I was actually going to mention the FT article you referred to. Have you seen the letter that came from Rob Jenrick to the Mayor asking for shovel-ready projects that will be, you've got to respond to, I believe, by the 18th of June?
Yeah, so I haven't personally seen the letter, but I have had a discussion with the Mayor's Chief of Staff about the range of capital projects that we could be putting forward. Now, some of the advice that we, I think, received from MHCLG, that because there are other funding discussions happening between TfL and DFT, that they did wonder whether the capital projects should be dealt with in that DFT discussion. I think it's our point that actually we need to be putting transport projects forward here, and any lobbying that you might wish to do of MHCLG on this issue would be very welcome, because it's really important that we see some of that money coming into the capital so we can do the infrastructure works that need to be done here.
Well, I'd be very supportive of putting the Hammersmith Bridge in the letter that's got to be in, I think, on the 18th of June. So thank you. Moving on to my final point, because I know the chair will want to rush me. In terms of Pimlico tube noise, which you'll be aware has been a long-running issue for my residents, has the new Delcor resilient track fastening product scheduled to be fitted in Pimlico between last October and this March now being installed? And if so, what were the initial results of the trial of this product?
So following your email to me on Friday, I did get in touch with the head of track at London Underground to ascertain exactly what has happened here. The Delcor fittings have actually been fitted on a part of the Jubilee line between St John's Wood and Baker Street, and some initial assessment done of those fittings to ascertain what the impact of those fittings is on noise above ground. The fittings haven't gone in on the Victoria line as yet. I think there are also some supply chain problems, because we need to, these fittings are actually bespoke, and Andy could speak more knowledgeably than me about this, but the type of sort of sleeper that you attach these fittings to is very different from line to line. I am acutely aware of the noise that your residents on the Victoria line are dealing with, and I am very, very keen that we find a way, to test these fittings. But I don't know whether Andy wants to say any more on that.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi, and thanks, Assemblymember Devonish. So in terms of the Pimlico area, we've not installed the Delcor fastenings yet. Delcor is a brand name, and there's various types. Our engineering team are currently finalising the design, and once that's finalised, then we'll be happy to write to the chair and your office and inform you of the plan to install. What we have done, though, is we took the opportunity over the late May bank holiday weekend to carry out an additional 48-hour closure of the Victoria line, which was already due to close for 24 hours for a significant piece of engineering work to replace a crossing at Brixton. And we took the opportunity to grind 10,000 metres of rail on the Victoria line, including the entire section from Pimlico to Victoria in both directions. And that has delivered some short-term benefit to residents. And as Deputy Mayor said, the fastenings that we've installed between St John's Wood and Baker Street are slightly different. They are Delcor, but they are slightly different, and the initial results from those are very encouraging. So we are just waiting now to finalise the engineering design, and then we'll be able to confirm to you what the plan of action would be for the Pimlico area.
Great. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you to your team, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Devonish. Now, Assemblymember McCartney, did you have a quick question at this point, or do you want to ask your question at another point? Okay.
Another point, please, Chair.
Thank you very much, then. If we could move on then to Assemblymember Russell, who will tackle the next two questions, E and F.
Thank you, Chair. I would also like to add my thanks to the Deputy Mayor and the staff team who were supporting her through the early days of the lockdown. The information that we got was really helpful to understanding what was happening, and I just want to put my thanks on record for that. You gave us a lot of your time and it was very much appreciated. My question now is for Gareth Powell and Simon Killenback, and is about street space. So how much will the implementation of the street space programme cost, and how is it funded?
Thank you, Assemblymember Russell. Thank you, Chair. So The Street Space programme, as you know, is a massive set of interventions right across London to allow for extra space to be given to pedestrians so they can socially distance as they say they're waiting outside shops and so on, and also to allow for the increase in cycling that we've seen such a huge increase in across the capital to be accommodated with additional space for cyclists. Within the funding letter that we had from the Department for Transport, some £55 million was ring-fenced for that programme. That is roughly split down about £45 million that will be allocated to the London boroughs for implementation on their roads, and £10 million retained by TfL for TfL-led initiatives across the capital. There's also a separate Department for Transport fund, of which notionally £25 million has been allocated to London, £5 million in the first phase at the moment, and then a potential another £20 million in a second phase. All of these programmes are being administered by a joint working group at the moment, which comprises of representatives from the Prime Minister's Office, from the Department for Transport, from London councils and ourselves. And to give you an idea of the scale of this, so not only have we already in TfL-led initiatives reallocated some 19,000 square metres of carriage space for walking and cycling, but we're also had over 500 schemes from the London boroughs put in through that funding mechanism, for which we are making decisions every week and releasing those just as quick as we can in for implementation. So it's a really big joint effort by ourselves and London councils, really moving very quickly to provide these facilities when they're most needed at the moment.
We can't hear you, Caroline.
Remember, you're muted.
Sorry, I was being so good, muting myself between questions. Thank you. So that means that's 80 million in total for the Street Space programme. Now, we've heard that Healthy Streets work has been refocused into Street Space. And we know that you've paused the LIP programme with the boroughs, and you've asked the boroughs for their sunk costs. Now, this looks like you're freezing the expenditure on those projects and closing those programmes down. So does this mean that there is going to be less money overall for walking and cycling than we had before?
So the programme at the moment is the very immediate focus is on these short-term temporary installations, because that's the most pressing need. But also what I want to assure you is that within that, we're also pressing forward with the existing programme where we can restart those programmes, but perhaps implement them using more temporary style materials so they can be delivered more quickly. So workers, for example, already restarted over in Hounslow, for example, on one of the cycleways there that was part of the previous programme. The rest of the financial year, the longer term funding for this, of course, is bound up in the process that Simon Killenbach outlined earlier, which is the need to get funding beyond October agreed with central government, so we can then go through the reprioritisation process that was referred to earlier. And clearly we'll be putting forward a very strong case to continue with this type of expenditure because of the very enormous importance that it attracts, particularly at the present time.
Yes, I mean, I can see absolutely this, the whole agenda of making sure it's safe for people to walk and cycle is very urgent while we're trying to make sure people have an alternative to using public transport. But I just want to dig back in a bit more to this Healthy Streets budget, because the budget for 2020-21 for Healthy Streets was £417 million, whereas Street Space is just 80 million. So that could potentially be a gap of about £337 million. Is that a gap that you recognise? Is it as bad as that?
I think, if I may, just Assembly Member Russell. So as Gareth was saying, we had to focus on the first half of the year through to September, and we were asked to minimise the call on government to fund it whilst we worked through with them the impact of the coronavirus, and then spent a greater amount of time working through with government the priorities. So it would be our full ambition to be putting forward an ambitious case for active travel and sustainable modes of transport for the second half of the year, and that we would make the case to government to be funding as much of this as we will possibly get them to fund. So I think just because the emergency budget didn't contain funding for the second half of the year, we will be making a case for an ambitious investment in active travel and on our own and the borough's assets for the second half of the year.
Does that mean that you will be trying to make sure that you maintain the full having budgeted for this year, but particularly as these measures to support walking and cycling are going to help prevent sort of gridlock on the roads and keep people out of their cars?
So I think we will, as I said, it's difficult to say we will do because everything has changed upon which we had the assumptions for the budget, and we need to re-examine whether what we were originally intending to do will best support social distancing and active travel and sustainable methods of transport going forward, where investments will help support those and help improve the walking and cycling agenda and the livability agenda for London. We will make the case for them, but we need to go through that process. And as I said, we will be ambitious in that. So we'll have to see where that turns out when we get to the July TfL board.
And if I might,
okay, we'll be watching that very, very closely.
And if I may, Assemblymember Russell will have an opportunity to interrogate that further at our July meeting.
Yes, indeed. I've got one question for the Deputy Mayor, which is, I know that this is in the wider TfL budget, that you had a review of toilet provision at stations, and I've still not seen in that. Now, given where we are at the moment with public health, the need for people to be able to wash their hands, in particular TfL staff being able to wash their hands as well as passengers, is there anything that TfL can do to provide more access to toilets for hand washing in particular within the emergency budget?
So that's something that I will need to pick up with Andy Lord. It's not something that I've discussed with him in the last couple of weeks, but if I can take that away and come back to you, Caroline.
If I may just add, Chair.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Assemblymember Russell, if I may just add, we have installed over 800 hand sanitizer units at all our stations across the tube network, so for passengers to use. So that is a pretty substantial investment that we've made as a direct result of this, so that our facilities for passengers to use across the network.
Yes, and that's hugely appreciated. But obviously, being able to wash your hands and also having access to a toilet is part of staff well-being and also passenger well-being, and means that people with disabilities or people who have a can't go too long between toilets, it would help that at this time. I've then got a further question for Gareth Powell for Simon. What are the risks regarding the forecast income levels in the emergency budget?
Thank you, Assemblymember Russell. So can I just give you a bit of context about how we constructed the revenue forecast for the emergency budget, and then I'll talk about the risks. So clearly, I mean, you'll all understand this is an unprecedented situation. So we worked very closely with the Department for Transport and the government's advisors at Imperial College to understand some of the COVID-19 scenarios that they were using to inform their thinking at the time at which we put the emergency budget together. And those ranged from a single peak with a quick return to life as normal to the full adaptive triggering, which was effectively turning social distancing on and off until a vaccine is found and deployed, which could take many months and well into the course of next year. So in discussion with our own board and DFT, we, for the purposes of the emergency budget, when we put it together in early April, took a prudent view about a 6-month period of social distancing, followed by a return to about 50% of pre-COVID demand levels for the remainder of this year. And that was our base case for our emergency budget and the £1.9 billion funding we asked government for the first half of this year. In terms of the risks around that, we continue to update and monitor with DfT, and I'll perhaps hand over to Vernon in a minute so you can talk a bit more detail about this. But there are constant iterations of these models, and what we're seeing now is that the risks and opportunities for the first half of the year could be up to 300 million better than we initially forecast if social distancing rules were relaxed more quickly and a return to demand was better than we expected, and a further downside of 200 to 300 million. Over the full course of the year, we had previously modelled a funding gap of 3.2 billion based upon more than 4 billion revenue impact over the course of the year. And what we're currently seeing, based upon our discussions with the government, is we see there could be a risk of plus or minus £500 million to that full year impact for this year, and then a further impact going into next year of between £1 and £2.5 billion. So significant risks remain around the revenue forecast. For the first half of the year, we have a funding package that covers those risks. For the second half of the year, we'll continue to work closely with government on agreeing the scenarios and how the risks will be managed. Vernon, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
No, thank you.
So am I right that that TfL is the only transport authority in the world that is dependent on fares income and has no government, outside of this COVID situation, doesn't have government support to run the transport system?
Yeah, so TfL is one of the very, very few transport organisations in the world, and certainly the only one in the sort of old world, if I can call it that way, of not the emerging world, that is so fully dependent on our revenues. And this has been a policy of successive governments to move the burden of paying for transport services and infrastructure from the taxpayer to the user. So as we've said, TfL in 2010, TfL's revenue made up about 50% of our income, and 50% was made up of government grants, direct government grants at the time. Between 2010 and now, TfL's grant level have been reduced by about 42%, just over £1.4 billion. And in 2013, about half of that 1.4 billion, the remaining 1.4 billion operating costs, so about 700 to 800 million pounds a year, was devolved in pound for pound from the grant amount into retained business rates, and then our investment grant followed in 2017. So compared to other major cities around the world, you'd see New York Metro with about 38% of its income coming from its revenues, and the rest coming from a mixture of grant and specific hypothecated taxes. So on average, you see most metros having subsidy levels of between 50 and 80% elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, so I mean, this sort of makes it absolutely clear, you know, what a difficult situation you're in. So the with continued social distancing, the fares model of income is really broken. But I was also thinking about some of your non-fares income, things like the advertising revenue, the business rates, which is obviously at risk, and obviously you've been giving very properly rates holidays to some of those other small businesses. So I'm wondering two things. One is, obviously, I sincerely hope the government actually provides some decent long-term support for TfL, because Londoners need it. But also, do you think it's time for drivers to start to contribute more to TfL's budget?
In the first instance, you're absolutely right. The only forms of income that TfL and the Mayor has devolved in order to fund transport in London, they're almost perfectly correlated. So if you have nobody travelling on the tube and little business activity in London, our media and retail income will also fall. And as we know, there's a significant risk to business rates income, not only for this year, but several years going forward. So we will need a return to long-term funding certainty. That was one of the principles upon which TfL was established as an integrated transport body, with a need for a 30-year capital plan that was efficient and efficiently financed. We've lost that over the last few years, since we haven't really had a comprehensive spending review providing long-term funding certainty since pre-2015. So we absolutely need that in order to be able to maintain our asset condition efficiently. And one of the conditions of the funding agreement with government is that there will be a government-led review of our finances, which in the first instance is concentrating on our efficiency, which we believe we'll be able to demonstrate the progress we've made over the last 4 years will go a long way towards satisfying that. But in the second case, we will have to look at who, the people and who benefits from transport in London, and how those that benefit pay contribute towards the cost of it, because clearly it can't all fall upon the fare payer, as it has done recently. And I think the final thing I would say is, unlike almost any other transport agency anywhere in the world, or even in the UK, not a penny of general taxation has been spent on supporting infrastructure and services in London over the last 3 years. So clearly we need to look in the round at who benefits and who should contribute to paying for transport in London as part of that review.
Thank you. That's it from me, Chair.
Well, thank you very much. That lays out the position very clearly, and thank you for that. Could I now ask Assembly Member McCartney to ask question 2G?
Yes, my first question is to the Deputy Mayor, if I can. As part of the funding package, a London COVID-19 Transport Task Force was set up, which has representatives from TfL and government on it. So my questions are around this. Firstly, can you tell me who's on the task force, and who actually makes decisions? Is TfL still taking those operational decisions day to day, or do they have to have the agreement of the task force?
You're muted.
Sorry, let me just sort that out. Yeah, so, on a day-to-day basis, one of the things that we were very clear about in the negotiations was that, operational safety critical decisions had to sit with TfL, and that's the responsibility of the Commissioner, and that's still his responsibility now. You asked me about the membership of the London Transport COVID Task Force and how it takes decisions. There's quite a lot of people that sit on it, because it's not just TfL and DfT. There's representatives there from Network Rail, the train operating companies, the British Transport Police, and there's a large number of civil servants, both from the Department for Transport and also Number 10. So formally it is jointly chaired by Ed Lister and myself. In practice, Ed Lister has chaired every meeting since the first meeting, which actually the first meeting of the task force took place before the funding deal was sorted out. So on that, you also would have Baroness Veer, who's a minister at the DfT. I think Paul Scully, the Minister for London, may also be on it. There's an active travel subgroup to that, which Gareth participates in, along with Will Norman and Andrew Gilligan. Gareth may wish to say more about how that subgroup is operating. Broadly speaking, they're weekly meetings, although sometimes other meetings take place outside of that formal structure. The easiest example, I think, to give you about how it actually works in practice One of the conditions of the funding agreement, for example, was to restrict free travel for holders of the 60+ photo card and older persons freedom pass from outside of peak hours. What happened was that we went away and looked at that as TfL. We considered the arrangements that are currently in place with London councils. We went back to government and said, I think the simplest way of making this work is to restrict early morning travel before 9 a.m. I think government may have wanted to align the cut-off point to the arrangements that exist outside of London, which is 9:30, but I'm quite pleased that we were able to agree a 9 a.m. cut-off point there. We wanted to ensure that older people could still travel for free in the evening peak. And so we made some suggestions and it was, agreed that we would take that back. That required a mayoral decision. As you might imagine, there are some quite heated discussions underway at the moment about the whole issue of the removal of free travel for children and young people, which was also a stipulation of the government funding agreement.
Okay, thank you. We're going to have some questions on that very shortly. But as terms of governance, I noticed from the funding agreement that 2 HMG appointed representatives are going to attend all TfL board meetings. Has the government formally notified you who they will be?
No, they haven't as yet. The condition of the funding agreement was that they could nominate 2 representatives to come along to the board. They wouldn't be voting members of the board, but they would have the ability to request information from TfL officers, and that also those 2 individuals, one of them would sit on the Programme and Investment Committee, and one of them would also sit on the Finance Committee. But to date, we have had no communication as to who those individuals will be.
Okay, thank you. And I may have some questions later on, Chair, but thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to the last question in this last substantive question in this part of the meeting. This is to do with funding again, and Assembly Member Prince is going to ask the question. I believe we have covered some of this in earlier answers, but Assembly Member Prince will want to take that into account as he asks the question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think most of it has been covered actually, but I'll just ask the question so you can add in the bits that are missing. I was going to ask a supplementary. I'll ask that now so you can build that into the answer and save time. So basically, what are the plans for the period beyond the lifetime of the central government funding and financing package? And how will the Recovery Board feed those plans into the mix? Thank you.
So shall I have a go at answering that one? So essentially, as Simon has already said, there will be this government review of TfL's funding and financing and its sort of governance structures more broadly. We don't have detail about exactly how that is going to be done at the moment, but clearly that review would need to report back before we get into the real detail of the negotiations, I guess, in the autumn again. I mean, from my perspective, Simon has set some of this out already, but since the government has withdrawn the direct operating subsidy from TfL, which most recently was worth about £700 million a year, it has essentially decided that it's moving to this position where the user pays. And that the income that we get from fares and other commercial activities such as advertising needs to cover the cost of the majority of our day-to-day spending. And the real problem with that, as I said in my opening remarks, is that when you only have a small fraction of people who are using your public transport services compared to normal, that does create a massive black hole. And actually those fares and commercial activity account for 80% of TfL's running budget, and on the basis that in April and for much of March and May, our fare income collapsed by 90%, you can see that there's a real problem there. Now, we could be in a position where, because of the changing way in which people are living their lives, lots more Londoners working from home, which is a good thing, that you don't see passengers returning to previous levels. And as a result of that, the funding model is fundamentally broken, and it doesn't really matter how much government might want to ratchet fares up by, or for TfL to cut jobs. You're never going to get to a place where the income from that could cover a £1.5 billion signalling upgrade or a £6 billion tube extension. So it's my view that the government has got two choices really in front of it. It either swallows its political pride and restores the operating subsidy to TfL, or it devolves more funding to London to enable it to pay for more of its own services, because currently taxes are levied on Londoners and London businesses, but then those taxes are actually paying for services and infrastructure elsewhere in the country. And there is a third option for government, and that's to basically choose to commit London to a low investment, low productivity future. Now, I think that would be the wrong thing to do, because no matter how life changes after this crisis, I think that London will still be the engine of the UK's economy. Now, it may be that the role of the central activities zone changes, because if 3/4 of all office employees are working from home, what does that mean for big, heavy bits of infrastructure in future? Does it mean actually that we need to be investing in more sort of local journeys? And so, there's big questions around all of this, but I do think that the government has to recognise that it needs to invest in London's public transport network to ensure that the sort of mobility that people need in London in order to, get the economy started again, that we can pay for those things. And at the moment, the funding model is broken.
Thank you, and we certainly would support you around, which you didn't mention actually, car tax coming into London, because as you know, the road fund licence doesn't come into London, it goes everywhere else. But I did quickly ask you about the recovery board and how you're going to feed those plans into there.
Well, I mean, I think are you talking about the task force? Or, yeah, the London task force. So at the moment, we've had quite a lot of discussions on the task force about the operational performance of TfL. That's the first item on the agenda, and Andy and Gareth are there, and they give updates on a weekly basis about those issues. We've talked about face coverings, and I, on a number of occasions, have made the point to government over recent weeks that we needed to move to a position where we were mandating them. We've had discussions about the 60 plus and older persons freedom pass, about under 18s travel. This bigger question about the review of TfL's finances, that has not been an agenda item to date in those meetings. Clearly the government has said it's going to commission this review, but I'm sure that as we go forward, those discussions will, if they don't happen in precisely that forum, they need to happen with government, because we need to find a sustainable answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Prince. I have Assembly Members Shah and McCartney who want to come in now. So, Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Mayor has already sort of given a background about the suspension of concessionary travel facilities. Two questions, please. As you know, Travel Watch and many other leading organizations have been campaigning because of concerns about withdrawal of peak time morning facilities for Freedom Pass and 60 plus Oyster. We understand that that was limited, the suspension, to 4 to 6 weeks time. Do we know when exactly it's likely to end? And the second question about under 18 travel suspension, free travel suspension. The government, in fact, Transport Secretary has stated in his written submission in statement that there will be special arrangements made for those children who qualify for free travel to schools. Do we know what those arrangements are? And again, what is the shelf line for the suspension? Thank you.
Okay, so if I take the question on the suspension of free travel during the early morning peak for 60 plus and older persons, Freedom Pass holders, I don't know where the figure of 4 to 6 weeks has come from. That is not a timeline that government have discussed with me at any point.
Chair,
yeah.
I had come across this in one of TfL briefings actually.
Okay, well, if you could
clearly written down as that.
Okay, if you could send me that document,
sure.
And I will look at it. But we have not set a date over which these restrictions apply. It will be subject to review going forward, and as the lockdown restrictions are eased and as we monitor what is going on in the public transport network, I would want that to be a subject of discussion with government. But honestly, to my knowledge, that is not a date that I'm aware of, and so I would like to see exactly what it is that has been sent to you. And I'm sorry about that, because I recognise that gives uncertainty to older Londoners. We were mindful in taking the decision, of course, about the period of time when the public transport network is most congested and busiest, and also mindful of the more severe consequences for older people when they get coronavirus. And so whilst I recognise this gives a lot of inconvenience to older people who would like to be travelling perhaps for doctor's appointments or for hospital appointments, this is actually quite a difficult problem to solve given the pressure on the public transport network in those early hours of the morning. So on the issue to do with the removal of free travel for children and under 18s, this is hugely complicated, and this is a point that I made very, very clear to government during the negotiations that took place. Anyone that has read the funding agreement closely will see that there is a line in that funding agreement that says that we, TfL, would bring forward proposals around the suspension of free travel for children and young people, subject to discussions in the task force about how to operationalise it. We fought for those words in that agreement because I knew it would be very, very complicated, and whilst I don't personally disagree with the need to get more children walking, cycling to school, not using public transport in the peak times, I am very concerned, and the Mayor is very concerned about the impact that the blanket removal of free travel would have on actually, some of the poorest Londoners. And remember that there is no requirement to provide any free travel at all by law to 17 and 18-year-olds who may be going to, college across the other side of London. Outside of London, some children are eligible for free travel to school. It's a very complicated legislative framework that sits underneath that, and it relates to age, it relates to the distance that the child lives from the school. It's further complicated by if you are on free school meals or if your family is in receipt of full working tax credit. Now, one of the points I've made to government is that, of course, if your family's if you're on free school meals, families in receipt of full working tax credit, that's not a status that is constant throughout the year. You may be in work in June, but come September you might not be, and so there would have to be a process by which children were assessed for free school travel throughout the year. We have no experience in London of having a process to verify eligibility for free school children. That competence does not exist in local authorities. So this is a long way of saying that, as soon as once we've looked into this, the Mayor has written to the Secretary of State for Transport and said, we think you should drop this. At a time when you're trying to get children back to school, and we've seen all the problems that government have had in this regard, this is just going to put big barriers in the way of poorer kids, and we want you to drop this as a condition to the funding agreement. The government wrote back and said no. The Mayor has written back again and said, well, look, this is your policy. So you need to set out how you see this working. Do you want children and young people to pay full adult fares? Do you want them to pay 50% fares? What are the arrangements for different age groups? How do you see the free travel for school applying in a London context? I know that a number of London local authorities are really worried about this, and I just think this is a monumental distraction at the moment. I think there are other ways in which we could be getting, more children walking and cycling to school. Some of the brilliant work that has been done around school streets, and I just think that we're using a sledgehammer to crack a nut here, and so I don't think it's the right thing to be doing, and that's going to be the subject of discussion going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, thank you. Can I just thank you, Deputy Mayor, for fighting for London's children and young people. I think it's really important that you are doing that, or that you and the Mayor are saying that quite clearly, because, of course, this is not just about travel to school. It's also about those wider benefits and that investment that this city has promised to make in its children and young people. And, for example, visiting museums, getting around our city, many families just would not be able to do that if this benefit was not there. So thank you, and I hope you will continue to fight for this in those negotiations. I've just been reading the Mayor's letter, dated the 8th of June, and he states in there that in actual fact this was dropped in a draft agreement just 2 days before the final agreement was signed, and that with the 6 weeks negotiations beforehand it was not mentioned once by the DFT or government. Did that come as a total surprise to you, and why do you think that was dropped in at the last moment?
I mean, it did come as a total surprise to me. I remember the email that I received about midnight on the Monday before the Thursday when the funding agreement was actually finalised. You would have to ask government ministers about why they decided to crowbar this in to the agreement at the very last minute. Their rationale, their stated rationale at that point in time, was that this was about easing congestion on buses and on tubes at the busiest point in the day. I have subsequently pointed out to them that on the buses we have introduced a maximum passenger cap, so no more than 20 people on a double-deck bus, no more than 10 people on a single-deck bus. So actually we're controlling the number of people on buses that way, and so your rationale for it no longer exists. Now their response to that at the moment is, well, what we can't have is a situation where children and young people in London have a more generous arrangement for free travel than elsewhere in the country. Now, I again have pointed out to them that if you look at London and compare us to the rest of the country, not only do we have much lower levels of car ownership, we're much more heavily dependent upon the public transport network. When you look at the pattern of where 17 and 18-year-olds go for further education, I know this from my time as a Member of Parliament, that you might live in Lewisham, but you might be going to college in Westminster or Islington, and you've taken a reasonable decision based upon the fact that you had anticipated that you would be getting free travel. And so I do think that's a real problem. I think it's a problem in London, when you look at the under 18 population, nearly 60% of under 18s in London come from a black and ethnic minority background compared to 43% as a whole. And so when you look at the equalities impact of this change, I'm really concerned about that. I know the Mayor is concerned about that. So those are the sorts of discussions that we're having. And I do think that, I think Londoners are really worried about it. I think families are worried about it. I think, you know, as you think about what's going to happen over the next year, you know, sadly, I do think that people will find themselves in more precarious situations around their employment. You know, the added worry of having to make an application to either the school or the local authority to then get your child free school travel if you've also just lost your job, I just don't think it's a sensible thing to be doing. And so that is why, you know, we're making the case to government that we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Can I say I'm having the same concerns expressed to me that you've stated. Parents have made decisions on education based on the ability to get to schools. I've talked to local authorities. They are extremely concerned that firstly they will have to pick up some of the funding for this, and they just do not have the headroom in their budgets. But secondly, they don't have the administrative capability to do this. But one other thing, if I can ask, is that children who are going to secondary school in particular in September have, over the last couple of months, been allocated their place. This is now a rite of passage. They apply for their zip card, and many of them will be doing that over this summer. Will TfL still be processing those zip cards?
As of the moment, yes. But, you know, because the government haven't said when they want to implement this. We've talked about the complexity of who is eligible for free travel, and the government haven't made it clear as to how they want to deal with that in a London context. We haven't spoken about the complexity of implementing this from a technological point of view. We haven't spoken about the limited functionality of the Oyster system. All of this feeds into this. And so, you know, until such time as government sets out what it wants to do, because it is government's policy, this is not the Mayor of London's policy, you know, that we will continue, you know, to work in the same way as we have been working.
Thank you, and please continue fighting. I find it quite astonishing that the Prime Minister, a previous Mayor of London, is seeking to impose this policy when he should know the benefits of it. Thank you.
Indeed, and you put your case very eloquently, Deputy Mayor. Thank you very much for doing that, and keep fighting for children in London. I would like to move on to the second, just before I move on to the second set of questions, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We had a request from one of the members, and I would fully endorse it. Is it possible for us to, as a committee, to have sight of or see the minutes for the Transport Task Force and the subgroup, the working group, because it would be very helpful in doing what we need to do.
So those minutes are jointly held between TfL and government. I will seek the permission of government to share those with you. I don't feel that I'm unilaterally able to commit without having had that conversation with them, but I undertake to have that conversation and come back to you.
Please do, and thank you very much. It is in our role as the in scrutiny and challenge and support that we have. So thank you very much, and I would really appreciate that if we are able to do so. Thank you. I'd like to move on to the second set of questions, which are around safety on the transport network, and I am mindful of the time. Members, I would like to try to finish this meeting by 4:15, but if we can keep our questions tight, we have guests with us who, frankly, their time is deeply precious at the moment, even more than ours. So can we move on to that section now? And I'll ask the first question, which is, how is TfL assessing whether the current measures being implemented to protect health and safety of transport workers and passengers are having a positive impact, and what further steps are being considered?
So perhaps I might ask and a combination of Andy and Gareth to pick up on these points, because you know, The things that we're doing, do differ but are similar in some respects across the surface area and in London Underground. And so perhaps I don't know who wants to go first. Gareth, do you want to kick off?
Thank you, Heidi. So, I mean, clearly the safety of all those working in the transport system has been absolutely front of mind for us as a team right from the start of this pandemic, and we've sought to try and bring in whatever measures we could as quickly as we could, basing our decisions at all times upon the available scientific advice at the time at which we were able to see it. Now, obviously, understanding about the disease and the impact of it and so on has been evolving over time, and we have therefore been changing and enhancing the measures that we've been implementing over time as well. So in the respect, for example, of buses, you'll be aware of the fact that we've done a range of measures for bus drivers and those working in the industry, absolutely jointly in collaboration with Unite the Union representing bus drivers and also with the bus operators themselves. Those measures have included putting film over the holes in the assault screens to further protect the drivers, to actually enhancing the assault screens completely so as to reduce the chances of the passage of airflow from one side to the other, to moving to centre door boarding and barriering off the seats most adjacent to the drivers, to then being able to reinstate front door boarding. Now we have enhanced screens in place. And throughout all of this, we've also enhanced both the antiviral cleaning processes to the very highest standards we could understand, not only from what we use in the UK, but also learning internationally. And all bus vehicles are regularly sanitised with 30-day antiviral processes, etc. And also then for drivers, making sure that hand sanitizer is available and so on. And most latterly, of course, the implementation of face coverings for all passengers. So in respect of buses, and I know Andy will say similar things for those working on the tube, really our processes have been geared towards trying to take the scientific advice and then implementing sometimes ahead of anyone else elsewhere, those kind of measures to try and make sure we do what we can to protect those providing these essential services.
Thank you, Gareth and Chair. So from a tube perspective, obviously in line with what Gareth and Heidi have already said, the well-being and safety of our colleagues and customers is absolutely the first priority. And I have to say we've had great cooperation and support from all our colleagues and our trade union partners throughout this pandemic that we've been dealing with. And from a specific safety perspective, we've got a range of measures, as Gareth already alluded to. So we were the first transport network to implement the antiviral cleaning regime that was applied across all our infrastructure, stations, our trains, and also our train depots and maintenance facilities, which is now being adopted more widely. We enhanced the cleaning regime and frequency on top of that as well. We introduced a number of measures when the social distancing requirements came in terms of making sure that our colleagues across the network could maintain social distancing, whether it's reporting for work at train operator depots, whether it's how they undertake critical essential maintenance work, and even where they can't maintain 2 meters, have clearly defined and risk assessed procedures which have been shared with the ORR as well, and following ORR guidance. We've also been following the rail industry. The RDG have been taking a lead, working with both the ORR and trade union partners to ensure that we had consistency across the rail industry in making sure that we followed PHE advice and also applied them in a practical way so that we could maintain those essential safety critical roles. From a customer perspective, you'll have seen all the customer communication that we've sent out through Vernon's team. We've applied over 236,000 vinyl stickers across the tube estate to make people aware of the social distancing requirements. Again, the first railway in the country to do that. We've put measures in place in terms of one-way systems and signage across the network as well. And also keeping our customers informed as to what we're doing around the cleaning regime and frequency of doing that. So that's an ongoing process. We continue to refine it as we learn more and more and as the advice changes. And I think I'm sure you all appreciate that certainly in the first few days and weeks, this was an ever-evolving situation. So we had to constantly change the advice and adapt our risk assessments to cope with that. Say we continue to focus on following the scientific advice, that's a priority for us.
Thank you very much. Now, Assembly Member Pigeon, you wanted to come in with a follow-up question on this.
Yes, I do. I mean, it really is to start looking forward. But in terms of the bus companies, I'm just wondering whether really they have stepped up to the plate in the whole of this, because you've got things like hand sanitizer, which TfL ended up bulk buying for the bus drivers and bus garages and so on. And it was TfL who had to step in and offer full sick pay from day one, so that bus drivers, if they did have symptoms, did feel unwell, actually stopped working. And I'm just wondering, in the future, when you're looking at the contracts you let for all these contracted services, obviously I'm mostly thinking about buses at the moment, but it could be the DLR or the overground. Will you look at the terms and conditions that the drivers and others have in their contracts to make sure that you're only contracting with people where you're not then having to go back and effectively bail them out because the private company isn't prepared to do so?
Thank you, Senator Pigeon. So we've had to work really closely with the bus companies, and just as it's been a fast-changing situation for all of us, there have been real issues we've had to overcome jointly. So in the example you give of hand sanitizers, at that time, at the beginning of the pandemic, hand sanitizer, antiviral kind of hand cleaning fluid was in short supply everywhere, and TfL was able to exercise its bulk buying capabilities in order to secure larger volumes of that, and then be able to distribute that to the individual bus companies, while they themselves were able to start setting up their own supply chain. So in some cases, it's because TfL has been able to do it. It's not a reluctance on behalf of the bus companies, and we've been working really closely together with the joint aim in mind of getting the facilities to the frontline colleagues as quickly as possible as we can do, irrespective of the contractual scenarios as we work through those weeks and days. In order to answer your question going forward, I think it's fair to say that we have looked at the regimes we have at the moment between ourselves and the bus companies and sought in all cases to make sure that we're doing the right thing for those that work in the bus industry. So the contracts are set up in a way that incentivises operators to perform in certain ways. And we're in a very different landscape at the moment in terms of the types of services that we need to provide, which we talked about earlier, and also the very significant impact on bus drivers and their workforce themselves. At peak, we had 2,700 bus drivers off on furlough with a variety of issues, 50% of which were in the vulnerable category, 25% of which were shielding. And these are volumes that really individual bus companies can't maintain on their own in the same way that the contractual mechanisms do. So, of course, TfL at that stage stepped in and made sure that everybody was looked after in the process, because the top priority was to ensure that the welfare of the bus drivers was first and foremost, and that we could provide the maximum service possible to those who needed to use it, the critical workers at the time, to make sure. So we're looking forward in terms of the way we operate with the bus companies. We're looking forward to make sure we continue that process, because we don't know over the next weeks and months how this is going to play out. But we do know that we need to work jointly with our bus operators so that we can continue those twin track approach to provide the maximum services for customers to get around London, and also to provide the protections for those that work in the bus industry to make sure that they're looked after properly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to ask the next question. Some of it has been picked up in the previous section. So if I ask the question, and I know that Keith Prince wants to come in on this one as well. So if I ask and then he comes in directly, and perhaps you can pick up both parts of it in one go.
Chair, to be helpful, my question's been answered. Thank you.
Okay, that is really helpful. So the way I'm going to ask the question, therefore, is to ask you whether you have anything to add to this. How successful have current efforts been to reduce demand and smooth congestion on the network, to enable social distancing to be observed? What other actions are you considering to achieve this, especially as demand increases? You may well feel that you have answered all of that, but if anybody has anything to add to that, that will be fine at this point, and then I'll move on to the next two questions.
Chair, I would just add that actually we look on a daily basis at the statistics about the number of passengers that are using services, and actually what we've seen in the last week or so on the tube is that actually some of the larger increases are happening later in the morning, which, you know, it's difficult to draw a causal link between our messaging campaign and then what thousands of Londoners do. But actually the fact that we're not seeing all of that coalesce in the very, very early mornings is actually quite reassuring to me, because it suggests that people are listening and are reading, you know, whether it's the emails that we're sending, the posters we're putting up, the radio adverts that are out there about, you know, avoid those really early hours between 5:45 in the morning and 7:45. And so we will monitor this as we go forward. But I also think the feedback that we have received from some of the businesses that we've been engaging with, be that retailers, be it developers, other, you know, on construction sites, about how, you know, start times of shifts are being staggered, how the opening times of shops are perhaps being pushed a bit later. That also provides us with reassurance, you know, some reassurance at this point, although it is early days, that, you know, the campaign to manage demand is having some impact. But, you know, I'd be lying if I said I thought this was going to be a walk in the park going forward, because none of us know exactly what is going to be happening in the weeks and months ahead. And so we've just got to, you know, adapt our operational response accordingly. And Andy on the London Underground will have plans in place to manage queuing at stations if that needs to happen. We've only had to implement that a couple of times. I think it's a couple of stations out on in sort of East London. But if we need to do that more consistently and across a larger number of stations, then we have plans that can be activated.
That's very helpful, and you would be thinking in terms of the sorts of plans you bring into play in Camden Town or Oxford Street, running up to Christmas, those sorts of traffic management issues. Thank you, that's really helpful. Now, I'd like to move on to a question, a very important question, and I want to make sure we had time for this. Assembly Member Shah, if you would like to ask 3C.
Yeah, thank you. London Travel Watch has analysed risks faced by BAME transport users as well as frontline workers. I know that the Mayor has recently announced his initiative of setting up a risk assessment for BME staff on transport as well. Can you please overall indicate what targeted efforts are being implemented to protect BAME staff members, particularly those who work on the front line, given that they are disproportionately affected by pandemic, by COVID-19? Thank you.
Shall I start on that one, and then perhaps may want to add? So I think the first thing I would say is that this is, you know, a really, you know, a very, very important, you know, area of focus for us, because nearly half of the Tube's frontline staff and nearly half of London bus drivers come from a black and ethnic minority background. Our starting point is to, you know, reduce the risk of exposure for everyone as far as possible, so that regardless of any individual risk factors, you know, we keep the overall risk as low as possible for staff and for passengers. So very early on in this process, one of the things that we did was we made sure that you know, people who have underlying health conditions, they may fall into the extremely vulnerable or vulnerable category, that, you know, if it was possible for them to work from home, to enable them to do that. If not, though, with some jobs, you know, a bus driver can't work from home. And so we were clear with the bus operating companies that, you know, people with underlying health conditions falling into those extremely vulnerable and vulnerable categories should be prioritised for furlough. We have since the 11th of May made face masks available to frontline transport workers since the government changed their advice. We've introduced social distancing measures in the depots and when staff are sort of signing on for shifts. And you're quite right, Navin, that since the 1st of June, when the Mayor made his announcement about all Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff across the GLA family having access to risk assessments, that TfL has put in place a sort of mechanism to be doing that. We've taken on more resources in the occupational health team, for example, and what we've also done is we've commissioned research from the Institute of Health Equity, led by Michael Marmot, to look into, the measures we have taken, for example, on the bus network, a rapid piece of work that should report back in the next couple of weeks to say, to assess the effectiveness of all of the things that we've been talking about that we've done on the bus network, and say, is there any more that we should be doing? I don't know whether Gareth wanted to pick up on how TfL will be implementing the specific risk assessments for BAME staff subsequent to the Mayor's press release on the 1st of June.
Thank you, Heidi. So the process that we are just getting underway with at the moment is based on something that has been piloted within the NHS for the NHS its own staff, which asks individuals who are concerned, and it starts off with the individual, to then go through a process where they're able to look at their own underlying health conditions, their own age, for example, their weight, and so on and so forth. And all of this builds up a picture in a structured way that gives them an overall risk that is evaluated. If they fall over a certain threshold, then they have specific conversations with occupational health specialists who are able to have a personal conversation with them about that. And then subsequent to those conversations, if there are adjustments that need to be made or other measures that need to be put in place for those individuals, then those can be discussed with their line managers and so on. Now, that's a process that TfL has been talking to the TfL trade unions about and is making available. And we'll also have talked to the bus operators and to others that work within the broader TfL family who are implementing exactly the same types of processes at the moment. So we're being quite broad-ranging with where this applies.
Thank
Chair, I'd like to thank for a particular reference to trade unions as well, because they have been lobbying very, very hard about the issue with the safety of BAME frontline transport workers. And this is the biggest, by far the biggest issue that has come about or been highlighted during a pandemic to do with London's diverse community. And I'm pleased that this is not just picked up as a transport issue, but issue right across everything that we do at the GLA. And this is something I'd like us to make sure that it doesn't drop off the agenda. And therefore, everything that we do does have even issues like quality impact assessments done so that we know that we are providing service which actually doesn't put at danger any community concerned. And I think that I'm pleased that we have got this agenda very much as a priority. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Shah. Now I have three Assembly members, Russell, Bailey and Devonish, who had indicated that they wanted to ask a further question. And if we can take those in that order, Assembly Member Russell.
I'm happy to drop it, given the time situation. Assembly Member Shah has covered the points I was going to raise.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Gareth, for your answer. Can I just, two quick questions, Gareth. What proportion of your BAME staff have met this threshold and needed additional support?
So the process is being rolled out at the moment. I don't have figures as to how many individuals have started to do the self-assessment process at present, but we're encouraging all that want to do the process, obviously, to undertake it. So it's not something that is in any way restricted. In fact, we're encouraging people to engage with the process, and we have the support with the trade unions to take forward any issues that arise or make any modifications to the process, for example, to make sure that people understand how to use it properly and so on, make it fully accessible for people. So we don't have specific numbers, we're just in the process of going through it now.
Will you be recording specific numbers? What I'm getting at here, what proportion of staff will do it? How vociferous are you being with advertising this amongst your BAME staff so they know it's available and they actually take this, what could for them be a very important step?
Well, I don't know if Andy wants to come in with any specifics on the tube, but our intention is that if anybody wants to use this process, of course they should do, and we're making that widely publicised in our internal communications and so on. We've issued guidance to all line managers to make sure that they're fully informed of the process and can address any conversations on a one-to-one basis with those who directly report to them. So this is fully available, and our intention is to make sure that those that want to use it can use it. So we're absolutely kind of encouraging that process to happen at the moment. It's not something that is necessarily, the percentages or so on will be down to individuals who choose or not to go through the process. It's not something that in that way is a mandation in any way for them to do. Andy?
I think the only thing I'll add is we will obviously keep records. So once we've been through a period of time, we will be able to provide that information, but there'll be two stages to that. Obviously, be those who've undertaken an assessment with their line manager and the assessment has decided that any mitigations can be made locally, and then there'll be those who require some form of intervention or further consultation with their occupational health team, which will take it to a next level, which again might result in further mitigations to enable them to work normally, or worst case might result in them being moved from role or potentially being asked to isolate or shield, depending on their circumstances. But we expect those numbers to be incredibly small.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And finally on this question, Assembly Member Devenish.
We're all obviously hoping there isn't a second wave or a third wave, Deputy Mayor. Is there anything you would do differently in terms of this particular issue if a second or third wave came out that you've learnt during this crisis?
It's a good question. And I think we have been in constant contact with the bus operating companies, with the trade unions, and what I would want to do is replicate that very intensive contact between frontline staff and senior management. I guess my one point about what has been good about the way that we have dealt with this is that there's been a lot of interaction, and I would want to maintain that going forward. I think that we were ahead of government in the week of the 16th of March when we changed, for example, our PA announcements in the tube stations. I can remember very early one morning texting Vernon, and Vernon will testify to this, to say, I think we need to be saying on the tube network, the tube is solely for essential journeys and critical workers. And even though the government at that stage hadn't defined the list of critical workers, we had to send a very clear message that behaviour in London needed to change. I remember sitting talking to Baroness Vere virtually and, begging her quite literally to define a list of critical workers because, people needed to know what they should be doing, whether they should be going to work, whether their kids, should be going to school. And so I think being very directive in the communications that we as TfL put out was the right thing to do. And I think you do need to be quite brave at certain points and just decide we're going to do this. And, even if it feels that, some of the time you might just be slightly ahead of what government are doing, I think looking back at that time, I feel that that was very much the right thing to do because, as I said in my opening remarks, every day matters in that context. Now, obviously, the test and trace system that the government is developing, if it works as it should do, it should give localised information to us as the Regional Transport Authority about, where perhaps new waves of infection are bubbling up. And I think we need to be very targeted in how we run our communication campaigns then, actually looking at the data that we've got about, who has been using the public transport network in those areas, and making sure that our communications and our messages are directed at those groups of people, and we can do that using the email database that we have. I think I remember saying to TfL, we've got to get these announcements translated into 15 different languages, and actually finding a way to reach all of London's diverse communities so that they all hear the same message. We may be putting that message out, but you need to make sure that everyone's hearing it. And I think if we could do any more of that, that would be a good thing. We did some of it. We got the leader of Redbridge, Jazz Atwell, talking on a Punjabi radio station. We got, there were broadcasts going on up on sort of Cypriot radio stations up in Enfield. But I do think that, every life matters, every life is equal, and we as the Transport Authority have a responsibility to make sure that our messaging is reaching everyone. And so I think we did that well. I think, could we build on that and do more of that? Possibly, yes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Now, we have two final sections to cover, so bear with us. We will get through this as quickly as we can, but I don't want to minimise either of those questions. So, Assembly Member Shah, if you would like to ask your question around assisted transport services.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Gareth. My question is to Gareth Paul. How are you ensuring that assisted transport services like Dial-A-Ride and Turn Up and Go are being delivered safely at this time?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Chair. So obviously it's been our priority to make sure that those services have been prioritised and looked after, and we've adjusted the way that we deliver those services as we've been through the learning experience and the changing guidance. Perhaps if I'll cover the particular Dial-A-Ride services that you referred to, and then I might hand over to Andy Lord just to talk about how some of the other assistance on the tube is being provided. So on Dial-A-Ride, of course, we have seen a very, very significant reduction in demand for Dial-A-Ride services, partly because the population that tend to use Dial-A-Ride services themselves quite often have been in one of the either vulnerable or shielding categories. And then also, sadly, the facilities that the Dial-A-Ride often takes them to have not been available under the lockdown situation. So things like community groups and so on have not been in operation. So where we have been conducting trips, where the drivers of Dial-A-Ride need to provide assistance for people to move into the vehicles and so on, they are wearing face coverings, obviously, and other forms of protection to make sure that they can do that safely. The vehicles themselves are fully sanitised with an airborne sanitizer every couple of weeks, which is well within the 30 days protection that particular sanitizer gives. And then we limit the number of people to the vehicles to one in order to maximise the protection for the individual, unless, of course, they're travelling with a carer or family member that they normally are interacting with. So we're trying to make sure that those services are provided in just the very best way that we can. That has meant that we have not had huge amounts of services. So, of course, I might just say we've been doing other things with those vehicles, such as helping bring facilities to those customers, such as medical supplies or, in some cases, food supplies. And I think the frontline workers in Dial-A-Ride have really risen to the challenge to be a community service, which, of course, they are, but doing different things in this time. Andy, I don't know if you wanted to cover the specific assistance on the tube.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. So obviously making sure that we can still provide a reliable service for any of our customers with any form of disability is absolutely critical. And we continue to offer the turn up and go service, and that's worked, continue to work well. With 2 or 3 things that we've specifically done, obviously our signage, we've made sure that it's suitable for the visually impaired, people who can see that. We are working hard currently with the groups that represent the deaf, because obviously one of the challenges with face coverings is that people who rely on lip reading, that's much more difficult now. So we're working with the groups who represent the deaf community to see how we can make that more easily available. And obviously our station staff are all trained to assist anyone with any form of disability. And if we do have stations where there are queues, any passenger customer who makes himself known to a member of staff will be escorted to the front of any queue and given the appropriate assistance in the station. One of the critical things from a social distancing perspective is obviously making sure that our lifts are available, and we did have to consider at one stage whether or not we should close stations that are lift only, because we weren't sure if there would be sufficient space. But we took a decision following careful risk assessment to keep those stations open with staff available to assist all customers, but particularly those who needed assistance at those locations. And if the worst comes to the worst and there isn't the possibility of anyone with a disability being able to use the station, then ultimately we would arrange taxi and alternative transport for those customers.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we move on now to the final question. And this is about the taxi and private hire sector. Assemblymember Curtin is going to lead, and Assemblymember Prince has indicated that he would probably like to come in with a follow-up. Assemblymember Curtin.
Great, thank you, Chair. This is a question to Gareth again. What additional measures are being considered to support London's taxi and private hire drivers?
Thank you, Assemblymember Curtin. So we've been in regular dialogue, in fact, a weekly call with representatives from both trades, the private hire and the taxi trades, all the way through this process. We have issued 6 updates to the industry, covering a wide range of things such as appropriate cleaning for their vehicles, about the way in which, for example, to sanitise keypads and so on for the collection of their fares. We've installed hand sanitisers at 7 locations for taxi drivers to use, in addition to the others that they can use, which are across the wider estate. We've given them access to tube toilet facilities for hand washing and so on. We've also put in place markings at the 20 most busiest taxi rank to help maintain social distancing between customers and so on. And then more recently, we have been arranging a process, because a number of the operators for private hire vehicles have been asking about putting in screens between customers and drivers. Now, the issue there, of course, is that the safety within the vehicle and the visibility that's needed through these screens, and indeed the operation of the airbags in some cases of vehicle types and so on, is all an important consideration. So we've set up a process with leading test houses, Millbrook and Myra, in order to be able to evaluate those screen suggestions where they are coming through, and to make sure that if they are installed, they're done so in a way that fits with the safe operation of the vehicle itself. And then finally, we've issued, alongside the recent, as of today, face coverings for all people using public transport, we've issued a guidance to the industry saying that actually passengers and those working in the taxi and private hire should wear face coverings in those industries as well within London, in our position as regulator.
Great, thanks. So I just ask one follow-up question. I mean, obviously, taxi drivers and taxi vehicles all have a full perspex screen between the driver and the passenger, but not all private hire vehicles do, as you say. I mean, how are you monitoring and enforcing social distancing within a private hire vehicle so that you can be sure that the driver and the passengers are at least 2 meters apart if there is no screen between them?
So what we have done is issued guidance in that, as far as is possible within the constraints of a private hire vehicle, and as you say, there isn't that much space within a private hire vehicle, that for example, that passengers sit diagonally on the opposite side and it's limited to one passenger, so that means that there's the maximum separation between the passenger and driver. But that's also why we've issued that they should be wearing face coverings as well for their further protection. But clearly there are constraints, as there are within all types of vehicles, and maintaining social distancing wherever possible is the aim, and we're doing what we can to advise the trades in how to respond to that requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, I'll ask two questions together. Firstly, around black cabs. We are discouraging people from using public transport, so surely this time now it is vital that black cab drivers can pick up and drop off their customers, especially disabled and less mobile Londoners, where they need to go. Could you perhaps comment on that? That's probably for Gareth. And for Deputy Mayor, as we're talking about users of red routes, you said it earlier, every life matters. I'm just interested in the progress you're making on Vision Zero, because I've got the latest figures for quarters 1 and 2 for 2019 that shows that KSIs, there were 71 pedestrians, 18 cars, 5 push bikes, 2 buses, 2 others, and 32 motorcycle KSIs. I mean, that's a massive number. That's 6 times the number of cyclists and 20% higher than all other wheeled users put together. Every life does matter, but what are you doing regarding Vision Zero and motorcyclists, please? But if Gareth could deal with the taxis first. Thank you.
So, as you say, black taxis do play an important role in providing accessible forms of transport, and it's really important that they're able to continue to do so. We are talking with representatives from the black taxi trade about how to do that in the context particularly of central London, where the demands on the road space allocation are particularly acute. So as we roll out the street space programme and so on, we're taking very good care to make sure that taxis do have appropriate access to be able to get to the places that they need to do so. And it's an important plank to make sure that exists alongside the street space activity. And we do have to make sure there's a balance for all types of road users so that we can function properly in the road network at the moment.
Thank you, Gareth. I won't make a point about it, but I'm not sure that every cab driver would agree with you on that. But anyway, thank you.
So just on the point you make, Keith, about the disproportionate number of motorcyclists that have been killed and seriously injured on our roads. And we have discussed this, haven't we, on a number of occasions previously, and given the overall volume of traffic on the roads has been lower over this period, the severity of some of the collisions that are happening have been very serious. So I think I'm right in saying, and Gareth will correct me if I'm wrong, when we're putting in new street space initiatives, we will be taking into account the impact of those on the overall road layout and road design, so that we're not doing anything that would compromise the safety of other road users there. That would include motorcyclists. You will be aware of some of the training that TfL provides as well, and we have, I think I'm right in saying, and Vernon may correct me if I'm wrong on this, that we have in some of the press statements that we've put out, and also the press releases that we've issued, talked about everyone observing the speed limit as well, because we have seen excessive speeding happening in some locations in London, and obviously excessive speed will lead to more serious outcomes from a road collision as well. So we have been acutely aware of that and have taken action over the last couple of months, to try and get behaviours changing on the roads.
I mean, I've noticed, Deputy Mayor, that you're actually running a campaign to prevent more speeding in the 30 mile per hour and 20 miles. And as a member of motorcycling group, we would encourage that, you know. But I do think that more attention needs to be spent on motorcyclists because now they're becoming more than disproportionately victims on our roads.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Prince. And I'd just like to, so that's the end of our discussion today. Thank you very much to all our guests for giving us so much of your valuable time, for answering so fully. It's been really helpful to have your answers here, for your briefings in between meetings, and for the work you do on behalf of Londoners. So thank you very much. And thank you for Assembly members for their questions. It now leaves me to do the formal closure of the meeting. So can we note the report and discussion formally?
Noted. Noted.
Can we also agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group leads to agree outputs from today's meeting?
Agreed.
Can we note the work programme, please?
Noted.
And can we agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree a response to the Network Rail consultation unblocking the Croydon bottleneck?
Agreed.
The next meeting of the Transport Committee will take place on Wednesday the 22nd of July 2020 at 11 a.m. That just leaves me to thank everyone for the meeting today. The meeting is closed.